Every now and again, I'll wake up with a random piece of game music stuck in my head, and it took me a few days before realising that this week's earworm came from the 1993 Konami game Rocket Knight Adventures. I hadn't played this game in years, but I have played it over many years, most prevalently upon its release, and then during the early emulation scene. I'm always a bit trepidatious to revisit a game that I once claimed to be one of my all-time favourites, in fear that the 30 years between then and now would have proportionally diminished the quality relative to the amount of time that has advanced. But if anything, I knew the soundtrack would still hold up, so I sat down for an hour and caught up with an old friend. When the game began, I was a little bit miffed at first, as I didn't at all remember this opening sequence, where an ethereal effigy of a crown-donning pig with a monocle looms over a land in style of Mr. X from Streets of Rage, and that was only further enforced by the stage screen, which I remember as being an orchestra of tiny animals playing along to the music. Turns out, there's more than one version of the game, and the original copy that I own has a different intro, where you see pigs chasing villagers out of a land, and the stage screens are what I remember, but the core game is exactly the same, so I just pressed on for ease. The titular Rocket Knight on an adventure is our sword-wielding Opossum, Sparkster, who we take control of across a series of side and vertical scrolling levels. Controlling Sparkster is pretty standard for a platform action game of the time, with slight interesting twists. We only have need for 2 buttons in the game, one for jump, and the other 2 both act as attack. Swinging your sword will result in a short circular projectile, meaning that you can dispatch enemies before they come into close proximity, and this never depletes, so you can use it to your heart's content. Speaking of hearts, you get 8 of them, and they represent your current health, which can be replenished by collecting fruit throughout the game. Pretty standard sounding stuff. However, where the game gets interesting is with your rocket pack. There's a clear reason why the first word in the title of the game is rocket. Holding down the attack button will very quickly fill up your boost meter at the top of the screen. Releasing the button will result in a short rocket burst to the direction you're holding. Stationary and diagonal attacks that connect will also result in a spin, meaning that a well-timed diagonal jump can turn a difficult enemy into a near enough a one-shot kill. Your rocket pack is also a necessity for level traversal, as the short thrust is needed to achieve certain heights to overcome obstacles, and the forward momentum to propel you out of harm's way and maintain a distance in certain set pieces. The game starts you off as you would expect, introducing hurdles to overcome for you to get a grasp of the controls, and basic enemies for target practice. Though it doesn't waste too much time before throwing in some pig-filled jeeps and steampunk-inspired machines, which are at a contrast with what is quite a lacklustre design for the level. This doesn't last for very long, however, as this is only a very brief walk from left to right before we fight our first boss, which after a simple first phase, plunges us into water, forcing us to rethink our strategy. After dispatching him, the game then shows its hand by wasting 0 time before landing you on a rocket boost power-up, changing the playstyle from platformer to shoot 'em up, as we are now flying full pelt with our rocket pack, taking on airborne enemies and an underwater boss akin to something from Thunder Force 4. The game from here on moves at a pretty relentless pace, throwing in new ideas and gameplay styles, with interesting well-crafted levels to suit each one. Each level has something unique for us that we wouldn't have seen in the previous levels. Level 2 takes place in a fort, which is host to environmental hazards to overcome, forcing our directioners to not take too long avoiding projectiles before progressing forward. Level 3 starts you off swimming, which, how refreshing to play a game from 30 years ago where the water doesn't instantly kill you, though I'm pretty sure he would drown in that armour, but I'll let it slide. We are then introduced to what is hinted at in the first stage with the robots jumping from the background with different layers that we can switch between. These little touches might not seem like much by today's standards, but at the time, any one of these mechanics could have been the basis for an entire game. The game also doesn't bog you down with the levels that you traverse. They are all short and interesting, populated mostly by gameplay mechanics and boss fights rather than standard enemies, which is lucky as the boss fights are the real standout here. They are for the most part big, with multiple phases, patterns to learn, whilst being accompanied by awesome music. In fact, the whole game is pretty consistent with a great soundtrack, which marries up perfectly with the design of each level. There are 7 levels in total, which might sound like it's a bit on the short side, but these are broken up into multiple sections, and the story, for what it is, takes you on a logical progression to what feels like a complete journey. There is also a plot synopsis in the instruction manual which does a pretty good job at summing up everything that's going on, but all you need to know is, there's a princess that needs saving who has been captured by this knobhead called Axel Gear. I know he's called Axel Gear because about 15 years ago me and my mate Aaron would call our team name that on Wednesday quiz nights down the Marston Green Tavern. But to go back to what I was saying about the game having a complete journey, The levels move from being almost fantasy medieval to industrial settings, eventually leading us to space. The final movement of the game using returning to Earth is an important gameplay mechanic. And despite the fact that you go from burning Greenland to fighting a giant robot fish to a spaceship, the levels connect in a way that you feel like you've actually made progress. Graphically, the game has picked a style that I think still holds up. Sometimes the backgrounds can be a little bit unimaginative, but other times they'll throw something at you that changes the way you interact with the level. Like this reflective tide of lava that you'll have to utilise in order to traverse the front layer without missing jumps. And then there are things that just look graphically impressive, like the scrolling on this ceiling. But the sprites and enemy design is where the game really excels. They're big, they're detailed, they move fast and they're enjoyable to interact with. The combat in the game also manages to remain fun by not actually having too much of it. As I mentioned before, you don't get much in the way of basic enemies. There is much more a focus on bosses which usually have a weak spot, the challenge there being figuring out how to hit it whilst avoiding attacks. And then there is this battle, which I haven't mentioned. Difficulty wise, a lot of muscle memory kicked in for me, and I bolted through the first few levels pretty much unscathed. But after that I did find myself dying quite a few times. Getting hit can pack quite a punch, and the length of some of the boss fights with their multiple forms and no health pickups can make it quite challenging with the limited amount of lives that you have at your disposal. I mean, obviously I'm looking at this through nostalgia tinted glasses, but I genuinely think that it would still be enjoyable for someone new to pick up and play today. That is if they aren't turned off by the opening 5 minutes, which don't really paint a picture of what's to come. It's a game full of unique ideas and different mechanics that all work. The levels don't outstay their welcome, and the ones that are longer are filled with more interesting things to fight or unique environments to traverse. It's not as amazing as when I played it all that time ago, but I appreciate it on a different level now. It's impressive in a way that time has been kind to, and I'd wholly recommend it for anyone exploring the 16-bits catalogue. Also, someone might mention it, but I have played the sequel called Sparkster. It was many years ago, and at the time I didn't really care for it, but I am going to go back and play it properly, as I need to give it a second shot. Thanks for watching, and go kill some space pigs!